A consistent theme of the Queen's long reign has been her abiding interest and dedication to the Commonwealth. As its symbolic head, she has overseen the transition from empire to a family of nations with an enthusiasm bordering on devotion. Despite frequent predictions anticipating the death of the Commonwealth, the Queen has played a central role in keeping it not just alive, but relevant. But why is the Queen so committed to this disparate association, and how does she retain the allegiance of the heads of member states?
She has been more responsible than anyone else for the transformation of the empire into the Commonwealth, and that is why it has lasted.
In 1947, on her 21st birthday, the then Princess Elizabeth, in a much celebrated speech, dedicated herself to the service of the Empire.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family.
In fact, the Empire itself was crumbling, and the post-war British government was well aware the links holding the Commonwealth together were in need of repair.
The empire at that point was certainly in transition, but it was not clear to most people that was what had happened. But of course the person who wished to destroy the British Empire was Franklin Roosevelt, and the person who was trying to defend it from a weak position because of the weakness of the country was Winston Churchill. But the sentiment for the empire was very great.
The King and Queen had been sent to South Africa partly to bolster the bond of empire, which many Afrikaners, it was alleged, had pledged themselves to break.
From Cape Town there was a welcome warm as its own sunshine. This universal greeting was worthy of a great occasion. This first entry into his capital of the constitutional sovereign of the South African Union. On a wider canvas, it was a demonstration of strength of empire.
Nothing really very long-term or positive came out of that visit, because I believe it was the following year that Vervoort, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa, declared the apartheid state. And that's something that neither King George VI nor his daughter would ever have been in favour of. And it was, if it was aimed at shoring up the African end of the empire, it misunderstood, I think, that the Afrikaners had quite serious reservations about the British that went back to before the Boer War. So it was a last throw of the dice, but it was one that didn't work.
For Princess Elizabeth, the trip was formative. Not only was this her first trip abroad, it profoundly affected both her outlook and her interest in the Commonwealth.
Those early experiences in South Africa made a profound influence on the Queen, and from that date onwards she took an immense interest in the Commonwealth. And remember, the Commonwealth is her thing. She doesn't have to take advice from the Prime Minister here. There are all sorts of Prime Ministers and other people involved, and that gives her a freedom of manoeuvre.
When Elizabeth became Queen 5 years later, there was much deliberation as to how she should be described. The old wording of the proclamation contained an outdated allusion to Ireland, no longer a member state, and to British dominions, a term likely to offend some countries. It was therefore decided to remove the reference to the imperial crown and refer instead to the Queen's position as head of the Commonwealth.
I think it's very significant because, as the great Lord Salisbury said, the commonest mistake in politics is to stick to the carcass of dead policies. And here was a great vision of the future and a transition and an opening into a new world and a new series of concepts.
At the Queen's coronation, the oath reflected these changes, distinguishing as it did between those countries where she remained head of state and those where her constitutional position was evolving in line with the changing political realities of individual member countries.
The Archbishop next administers the coronation oath.
Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, and of your possessions and the other territories to any of them belonging or pertaining, according to their respective laws and customs?
I solemnly promise so to do.
The role of the Queen was really first among equals, not somebody ruling over a lot of different countries. And that was very important change because that enabled the Commonwealth to advance on a new path, and it also suited the talents of Her Majesty, who doesn't believe in imposing her will on other people.
Gliding through Sydney Heads, the sleek white liner Gothic brings Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh to the threshold of Australia. Thousands line the grey cliffs bathed in hot sunshine. From the bridge of the liner, the Queen looks down upon a scene of welcome more spectacular and perhaps more excited than any that has greeted her throughout her long journey across the world.
In November 1953, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh embarked on a 5.5-month coronation tour of the Commonwealth. The trip took in the Caribbean, Uganda, Malta, Gibraltar, Ceylon, plus 3 months in New Zealand and Australia. It was the last occasion for an extended tour of what remained of the Empire, and the final time the crowds would be so large. In Australia, for example, an estimated 3/4 of the population turned out to see the Queen in person.
Now, in an open car, the Queen and her husband prepare to make a 9-mile-long drive through the streets of Sydney. About half of the 3 million people who cheered the royal couple slept on the pavements all night for a glimpse of this historic scene. The royal car moves at about 10 miles an hour, for if it were to travel more slowly, the engine would overheat, so great is the temperature in the city.
In sort of 1953-54, the Queen is young, she's quite exciting. She's a very different face of the monarchy from that anyone's seen in their lifetimes, right around the British possessions around the world. And although there are movements in many countries, particularly black and Asian countries, to have independence and to have majority rule in those countries, an awful lot of people in them still have great affection for Britain. And so when the Queen turns up being very genuinely enthusiastic and friendly to countries, everybody's very glad to see her. And of course in the white Commonwealth, in Canada and Australia, New Zealand, the enthusiasm is absolutely rampant in those days, not least because so many people have such strong family ties to Britain.
If the coronation tour had demonstrated the bond of loyalty between Commonwealth countries, the Suez Crisis of 1956 witnessed the humiliating spectacle of a majority of Commonwealth nations voting against Britain in the United Nations. In July that year, Egypt had nationalized the Suez Canal, precipitating 3 months of diplomatic turmoil. When Egypt refused to meet the demands of Britain, France and Israel, military action ensued. British and French troops moved against Egypt on the 29th of October. On the 6th of November, international pressure forced the London and Paris governments to order a ceasefire. It was a humiliating climb down.
I think the old Commonwealth by which I mean the dominions like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they were doubtful but supportive. But the rest of the Commonwealth was not supportive at all. And they, of course, were right. They didn't know the full story, but it's a shameful period in our history. The lies, the chicanery, the deception of Parliament, the secret meetings with the French, we've seen nothing like that before.
The Queen had no direct role, but she was the recipient of messages from Commonwealth governments opposed to Britain's aggressive stance. She was in the anomalous situation of either keeping secrets or deceiving ministers.
The Suez Crisis is a perfect example of the great tension in her different roles. The Queen not only is head of the Commonwealth, but she's also head of all of the individual countries in the Commonwealth. She's their Queen as much as she is the British Queen. But at the same time, of course, she lives here. She is primarily Queen of England, and therefore her connections with the British Prime Minister are much closer than any of the others. And so this terribly profound and serious crisis was something that she appreciated could threaten her relationship with her other crowns.
Suez was also a turning point, the moment when the British government was forced to acknowledge the days of the old empire were finally over.
From that moment, the British Empire was gone because it had existed partly on fact, but partly on imagination and image, and this was destroyed by Suez, so that accelerated the end of the imperial period immensely, and it weakened the whole idea of empire, and it weakened the idea of Britain as a major world power.
By 1960, as the empire unravelled and former colonies became republics, another association was competing for Britain's attention, the common market. Domestic opinion was split as to the merits of joining a European trading bloc, and in turn the damage this might do to the tenuous ties binding the Commonwealth.
The Queen looked very carefully at the very deep constitutional implications of joining the then common market. It was a form of threat, really, to her, not only as head of the Commonwealth, because the links with the Commonwealth were going to be broken, many of them, especially the trading links, but much more seriously, really, in the long term, her own sovereignty as sovereign of Great Britain was also going to be threatened by the accession to a form of union which, as we've seen in the intervening period, has become ever more serious in terms of British independence and sovereignty.
Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was persuaded of the merits of joining Europe. He began an offensive to persuade fellow European leaders of the benefits of British entry, including inviting the French President Charles de Gaulle to London for a lavish state visit in April 1960. The Queen and other members of the royal family were called on to provide the appropriate ceremonial welcome. It didn't work.
He was charmed by the fact the Queen spoke fluent French. Now, he wasn't used to that on his travels around Europe, and he certainly hadn't discovered that in any British Prime Ministers, so that was a huge advantage, and she was able to turn her charm on him, not just in English, but in French. But unfortunately, or some would say fortunately, the charm wasn't enough for him to recommend Britain joining the common market.
De Gaulle's indifference only served to strengthen Macmillan's determination to secure British entry to the common market. The issue struck a discordant note at a conference for Commonwealth leaders the following month. It seemed that many particularly new Commonwealth countries were more anxious, not less, to retain their link with Britain. One outcome was a set of formal invitations to the Queen to visit the Indian subcontinent.
It's like young children, isn't it? You want to keep hold of Nanny or to keep hold of Mummy, and before you found your feet, you're conscious of the need for support from history and from a more powerful country. Now that gradually wore off and turned from dependence into a friendship. And there again the Queen played a vital role in that.
The Queen and the Duke began a 5-week tour at the beginning of 1961, travelling to Nepal, India and Pakistan. 500,000 people welcomed the Queen to Delhi, but the Indian visit attracted attention for all the wrong reasons. The Maharaja of Jaipur had organised a tiger hunt for his royal guests, and although the Queen did not carry a rifle, a tiger and tigress were shot, the latter by the Duke. The incident caused outrage in Britain, particularly among animal welfare groups. Yet in India, millions of Commonwealth citizens were unperturbed. This was a test case for the Queen as head of the evolving Commonwealth. Should she stay British in India or adapt to Indian practices?
I think the Queen going to the subcontinent, taking part in a tiger shoot, is no big deal. The Queen has always fitted in extremely well with those cultures that she has gone to visit, and she just has instinctive good manners and knows how to behave. And I don't think that what she did in the subcontinent in 1961 is any different from what she's done all over the world ever since.
A bigger challenge for the British government was a proposed trip to the new Republic of Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah had been the first black African to lead his country to independence, and the first to move towards single-party rule and dictatorship. This was a new Commonwealth dilemma, whether to accept a dictatorship or banish it from the new and fragile Commonwealth.
The President told the Queen he hoped she'd enjoy every minute of her stay in Ghana.
The country was changing. I remember the High Commissioner for the Gold Coast. I was at a dinner in London with him, and he made a speech, and he said, we look to you for your constitution, we look to you for your great history, we look to you for your great Queen, and above all, we look to you for the cash. And ended, don't forget the Queen, don't forget the constitution, but above all, don't forget the cash. So it was a different relationship.
The Queen was impatient with the politics. She believed her trip to Ghana, which took place in November 1961, was important for the greater good of the Commonwealth.
Whatever else is blown into the limbo of history by that great wind, the personal regard and affection which we in Ghana have for Your Majesty and for Your Royal Highness will remain unaffected by that hurricane.
The Queen, in her speech, talked about the Commonwealth family, where differing viewpoints could be accommodated.
One of the great features of any family association is that it is not based upon some rigid creed or set of rules. It derives its strength from the respect and affection which the members have for each other. This allows a wide degree of disagreement and intelligent discussion. I think it is of the greatest importance that we should remember this within the Commonwealth family.
The trip was deemed a success. It caused outrage in South Africa, which, due to its apartheid policy sanctioning racial segregation, was now out of the Commonwealth. Commentators there complained about the Queen fraternizing with black natives. By contrast, the Ghanaian press hailed her as the greatest socialist monarch in the world.
The chiefs showered gifts upon their royal visitors: elephant tusks, lion skins, a tom-tom drum for Prince Andrew. One gift surprised Prince Philip. Chief Tumu asked the Duke to take off his field marshal's cap and then put this huge flapping leather hat on his head. Prince Philip quickly put back the regulation cap.
Throughout the visit, the Queen found herself hardly ever out of Nkrumah's company, an experience that gave her a penetrating insight into the working of the Ghanaian leader's mind. The visit further helped to redefine her dual roles as head of the Commonwealth and Queen of the United Kingdom. The number of republics within the Commonwealth continued to increase. Of the Commonwealth realms where the Queen remained head of state, the Republican movement gathered momentum. British entry into the European Union in January 1973 further fueled the cause of anti-monarchists in countries such as Canada and Australia. Once again, the Queen's position as head of the Commonwealth needed to be redefined.
She saw her role as a reconciling one, and she obviously had to follow the advice of her ministers here, but she was also very sympathetic to the Commonwealth, and so her role was really not so much a mediatorial role, but a calming role, and trying to make sure that the Commonwealth got a fair deal.
Against this background, the sceptics had anticipated a cool reaction when the Queen toured the Commonwealth during her Silver Jubilee year of 1977. Certainly in Australia, the reception was mixed.
People do say to this day in Australia, why should we be ruled by a head of state who is really not even master in her own house now because of the way that European laws have been foisted upon Britain. And it is true that unlike when she came to the throne in 1952, we are part of a big country and we have had to pull lots of our sovereignty. I don't know that that has really changed the Queen's view of the Commonwealth.
It's been a long and exhausting tour for the Queen, who today stepped ashore at Port of Spain, Trinidad's capital. A noisy 21-gun salute had the police horses twitching on the quayside.
A dilemma of a different kind would dominate Commonwealth business during the 1980s.
The mood changed, though, at a local factory where over 100 anti-apartheid demonstrators were waiting for the Queen to arrive. The shouts were mostly directed against Mrs. Thatcher and the British government, but there were some chants against the Queen herself.
The anti-apartheid movement wanted Britain to impose sanctions on South Africa, a move to which Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was opposed. Across the Commonwealth, protesters railed against the position of the British government. For example, when in 1986 the Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe visited Zambia for a televised meeting with Kenneth Kaunda, he found the President to be fiercely critical of Mrs. Thatcher.
Outwardly, the pleasantries were observed, but it is not often that a British Foreign Secretary hears the British Prime Minister denounced to his face in a 15-minute public lecture on occasions like this. Yet that is what President Kaunda did, coming close to accusing Mrs. Thatcher of double standards and calling her attitude on sanctions un-British.
It's very un-British of the British Prime Minister to behave the way she is doing now over sanctions.
A report in the British press, quoting sources close to the Queen, suggested the sovereign too was unhappy about a number of issues, including the controversy over sanctions and the impact on the Commonwealth.
Now we hear that in fact that was a newspaper story made up by the newspaper concerned and that it wasn't true at all.
The Queen's commitment to the Commonwealth did appear at odds with the attitude of her Prime Minister in Britain. Further, the much-denied report acted as an emollient to bolster the Queen's reputation in a number of Commonwealth countries.
And I think that in 1986, when that Sunday Times story appeared, there may have been a grain of truth in it, that the Queen was not criticising Mrs. Thatcher, but she was criticising a policy that was destabilising the Commonwealth, because we know that the Queen is very enthusiastic about the Commonwealth.
The Queen's stubborn refusal to see the Commonwealth as irrelevant endeared her to many within the so-called family of nations.
The Queen of Barbados took her place in the Senate chamber to a warm welcome from a bewigged Mr. Speaker. The first Barbadian assembly grew from a meeting in a pub in 1639, a notion which prompted a royal joke.
It would appear that Barbadian hostelries of the 17th century had more to offer than mere hospitality.
She has her own very definite convictions, but all the time she understands that there are other points of view and she knows how to respect them. And that's why all the Commonwealth leaders are so fond of her.
The moment when the Queen, in a chartered commercial airliner, returned to South Africa, stepping onto the soil of a country which isolated itself from the British monarchy for 34 years outside the Commonwealth. Deputy President Mbeki welcomed her.
The Queen's dedication to the ideal of the Commonwealth, spawned nearly half a century earlier on her first trip to South Africa, was rewarded in 1994 when President Nelson Mandela's Democratic Republic re-entered the organisation. The Queen returned there the following year.
Zulu dancers bid farewell to the Queen tonight, a spectacular end to an historic visit. A visit the Queen has described as one of the most rewarding of her reign. Earlier, after a final walkabout in Durban city centre, she spoke with almost unprecedented warmth of the impact the trip had made on her.
You have rounded off quite splendidly what has been one of the outstanding experiences of my life. I shall never forget the welcome you have given us. We shall take back in a new form an old message. Faith can move mountains. Faith can recreate a nation.
Hosting the farewell ceremony tonight, President Mandela repaid the Queen's tribute.
The warmth and hospitality with which Her Majesty has been received is an indication of how the visit is appreciated.
For the Queen, a parting gift from the Zulu King, a prize bull.
Of high fertility, wonderful genetic characteristics.
A gift she graciously accepted, but will not be taking home.
The Queen says goodbye.
For a nation like South Africa to rejoin after everything that had happened, to rejoin and to have as its president Nelson Mandela, the Queen was as swept up as the rest of us in the glory and emotion of that. It was absolutely clear that she thoroughly enjoyed that visit and found it utterly fascinating.
The banquet this evening in Madras, at which the Queen was supposed to deliver a short speech until the Indian government stepped in and said it would be against protocol, a very embarrassing diplomatic mix-up.
A more delicate mission came 2 years later, not long after the death of Princess Diana. The Queen paid a double state visit to Pakistan and India to mark the 50th anniversary of the independence of the region. The aim of the trip was to strengthen ties with the two countries and to try and improve relations between the warring neighbours. A call within a speech in Pakistan for the two countries to renew efforts to end historic disagreements inflamed opinion in India. For the rest of the tour, the fallout from the address became effectively the only issue.
The relationship between India and Britain is a sensitive one for very well-known historical reasons. But it was bound to be a visit that was going to be difficult to navigate, given the historical sensitivities.
The sensitivities are such that what actually her advisors allowed her to do, not the Queen herself, of course, because she doesn't write those sort of speeches, her advisors allowed her to sort of express an opinion which was pretty inflammatory. So by the time we left in Pakistan and flew down to India, the politicians down there were not at all pleased to see her, and there was quite a bit of reaction against her there.
Palace officials pointed out that what the Queen said was guided by the Foreign Office. She herself was not blamed for the row, but it once more highlighted the sometimes contradictory nature of her role as Queen of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth.
The diplomatic tensions of the past week have been produced in part by what the Queen did say in speeches she's made in India and Pakistan. Royal officials stress that when she's abroad, the Queen only speaks with the clear approval and encouragement of the Foreign Office. Government circles in London may find it awkward to be reminded of this, but one senior Buckingham Palace advisor said today, the Queen does not go out on a limb.
I can't imagine the Queen was very pleased. She has, throughout her life, been exceedingly careful. You might say not to express an opinion, but that's in the proper constitutional sense. She should not, and she doesn't. And she's very rarely been caught out, if you like, but in the government of the time used her visit used it to try to push through as they would see it, a more rational approach to the long-standing bitterness, particularly over Kashmir between India and Pakistan. And it backfired, quite simply, and Her Majesty would not have been pleased about that.
Australia's Prime Minister said the Queen shouldn't expect the enthusiastic welcome she received on previous trips. In fact, 2,000 people came to welcome her to church today, and not a Republican in sight.
For a beleaguered monarchy, the result of the Republican referendum in Australia in 1999 was a welcome fillip. Despite expectations to the contrary, Australians voted to keep the Queen as head of state.
We don't want a republic. Look at all the countries that have got presidents. What are they doing? Fighting and killing people.
I see no reason to change. And you will notice how many faces in this crowd were of obviously Aboriginal, Asian or Pacific Island origin. The support for the monarchy is by no means confined to the Blue set or to unreconstructed Anglo-Saxons.
Australians voted to keep the monarchy in 1999 because a group of urban liberals in Sydney in particular, but also in Melbourne, decided that power should reside with them rather than with the Australian people. And faced with that in a plebiscite, the Australian people decided to vote to keep the monarchy.
During her visit to the country in March 2000, the Queen was careful to confirm her symbolic role as head of state. The future of Australia in any later referendum would be for the Australians to decide.
4 months after being confirmed as head of state, this wasn't planned as a victory tour for the Queen, but it's beginning to look like it.
The Queen takes all her duties extremely seriously. She made it clear as a young girl that she would do so throughout her life, be it long or be it short. She said, well, it's been a very long life. And she has continued to hold fast to her duty. And a couple of the things she takes really seriously is the Commonwealth and also her role as head of state of many countries. So she's not going to be delighted at losing that position, especially if it's a big country like Australia, say, or New Zealand, or one of those. But she's also a realist, an absolute realist. And it has been said, and I think the Queen thoroughly goes along with it, that if a nation wishes to vote her out, if you like, that's fine. That's for that country to decide on that. The Queen would be quite content with it in the constitutional sense, and that's the important thing. Emotion, feeling of tradition and everything else would be laid to one side. The practical side of the Queen would say, fine, let them go.
During her next visit to Australia in 2002, as part of her Golden Jubilee Commonwealth tour, the crowds that greeted her were greater than anywhere else on the tour. She returned the compliment by expressing her affection for the country and its people.
Whatever may lie ahead, I declare again here tonight that my admiration, affection and regard for the people of Australia will remain, as it has been over these past 50 years, constant, sure and true.
I think distance breeds more affection in a way. And when she goes to, perhaps is driven through some small town in a dusty part of the Australian outbacks and the children turn out and wave a few Union flags, I think it does touch her. It's quite amazing, isn't it? There's the Queen, thousands and thousands of miles away, suddenly turns up on your doorstep and people show their affection.
On a windy morning, the Queen arrived in Montego Bay to the sound of a group of children singing one of Jamaica's most famous songs.
Throughout her reign, the Queen has, as she once promised, given herself to the service of the Commonwealth. As with her prime ministers, she does not interfere in the politics of member countries, but she does provide a listening ear and a steadying influence during turbulent times. In this way, the Queen helps keep the association not just alive, but of value to the states that comprise this unique family of nations.
She is a person without any kind of racial prejudice. She loves all those people, and she knows them all by their Christian name. They're devoted to her, and so this is really an example of how personal diplomacy and friendship can really create something, and she has been more responsible than anyone else for the transformation of the empire into the Commonwealth, and that is why it has lasted.